Today, we will be covering task list item D3, implement interventions based on modifications of antecedents, such as motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. This training program is based on the RBT task list and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for RBT certification. The program is offered independent of the BACB. Throughout this video, you will be required to fill out a homework sheet, and following the video, you will take a short quiz. The agenda for today is first to talk about discriminative stimuli, then to move on to motivating operations, and finally to compare the two, discriminative stimuli or SDs and motivating operations or MOs. Antecedents are events, actions, or circumstances that occur immediately before a behavior. Throughout this training, when referring to antecedents, this can include motivating operations that may be in effect or discriminative stimuli. The first antecedent we will be covering is discriminative stimuli. A discriminative stimulus is defined by Malott and Shane as a stimulus in the presence of which a particular response will be reinforced or punished. On the other hand, an S delta is a stimulus in the presence of which a particular response will not be reinforced or punished. Again, these are stimuli that are present before a response. The SD will signal whether a response will be reinforced or punished, and an S delta signals when a response will not receive reinforcement or punishment. Here we see a simple, undiscriminated contingency in the Skinner box. Rudolph the rat has no water, he presses a lever, and he receives water. In an undiscriminated contingency, the outcome will follow the response regardless of the environmental stimuli surrounding the response. However, here we see a similar contingency in the Skinner box. Rudolph the rat has no water, and only in the presence of the light will the response of pressing the lever be consequated with water. In the presence of the light being off, pressing the lever is consequated with no water. The contingency in the presence of the SD is reinforcement, and the contingency in the presence of the S delta is extinction. We would then expect to see lever presses increase in frequency when the light is on and decrease until they are no longer occurring in the presence of the light being off. This is also called extinction. Question: what is the light being off in the Skinner box considered? A motivating operation, B, discriminative stimuli, C, SD, or D, S delta. On your homework sheet, fill in the following question. What is the light being off in the Skinner box considered? I'll give you some time to get that question filled in. The answer to the previous question was D, S delta. The light off signals that responses, lever presses, will not result in reinforcement. This is also called extinction. Extinction is defined by Malott and Shane as stopping the reinforcement or escape contingency for a previously reinforced response causes the response frequency to decrease. On your homework sheet, fill in the answer D, S delta. I'll give you some time to get that answer filled in. Now let's go over what an SD might look like in the applied setting. This is usually seen as an instruction. For example, for the procedure imitation, the SD would be the technician saying, do this, and modeling the response for the student. Whereas for the procedure following directions, the SD would be the technician saying, touch nose. Discriminative stimuli do not always have to be contrived situations, however. Oftentimes, the environment should evoke a response. For example, the sight of a bus signals to a student that it's time to get ready to leave. Here we have a contingency for receptive ID where the SD is an instruction. Before, the student has no M&M, and only in the presence of the technician saying cat will the behavior of touching a cat be reinforced with an M&M. However, if the student were to touch a picture of a cat in the presence of the S delta condition, the technician saying dog, the student would not receive an M&M. The top contingency here is reinforcement, and the bottom contingency is extinction. You would expect the student's response of touching the cat in the presence of the technician saying cat to increase, and touching the cat in the presence of the tech saying dog to decrease. Now we can look at a contingency where the environment is evoking the response. Here, the student is unable to get their book bag, and only in the presence of the SD, the sight of the bus being outside, is the child's behavior of walking towards their locker reinforced with being able to get their book bag. However, in the presence of the S delta condition, no sight of the bus outside, the child walking towards their locker is not reinforced, and they are still unable to get their book bag. Again, the top contingency here is reinforcement, and the bottom contingency is extinction. You would expect the child's behavior of walking towards their locker to increase when the bus is present, and you would expect the child's behavior of walking towards their locker to decrease when there is no bus present. A conditional stimulus is defined by Malott and Shane as elements of a stimulus have their value or function only when they are combined. Otherwise, the individual elements may be neutral. In reference to discriminative stimuli, this means that there may be two elements to the stimulus, and if both elements are not present, then it will not function as a discriminative stimuli. Cooper, Heron, and Heward state that the response that will produce reinforcement in the presence of a particular stimulus depends on, or is conditional on, the presence or absence of other stimuli. Here we see the contingency for the procedure of imitation. Only in the presence of the conditional stimuli, the tech clapping their hands and saying do this, will the child's behavior of clapping their hands result in the delivery of an M&M. In the presence of the S delta condition, the technician only clapping their hands, the child will not receive reinforcement. Both parts of the SD need to be present. Sometimes our kids may not attend to both aspects of the discriminative stimulus and may overgeneralize the response. Therefore, we must extinguish any instance when both elements of the SD are not present. For example, when moving up the prompt hierarchy for the target my turn, you may gesture towards your hand while saying my turn, and the client will imitate that response instead of handing the item over. However, because you did not say do this, the client's imitating will not result in reinforcement. Next, we will watch a video in the applied setting, then discuss the SD in the video.
Good waiting. Nice work touching the card. Good job waiting. Nice touching the card, Katie. Nice touching the card. Good waiting. Nice job touching the card. Good waiting. And awesome job touching the card. Nice work waiting, Katie. And good job touching the card. Great waiting, Katie, and good touching the card. Awesome job waiting, Katie. Nice touching the card.
On your homework sheet, fill in the question, what were the SD and S delta? I'll give you some time to get that question filled in. The answer to the previous question is the SD, green card, and S delta, red card. On your homework sheet, get this filled in. I'll give you some time to do that. This is the contingency for the video example. The student did not have the iPad, and only in the presence of the SD, the card being flipped to green, were touches on the card on the table reinforced with the iPad. Anytime the student touched the card to man for the iPad when the card was flipped to red, it was not reinforced and was therefore extinguished. Throughout the video, you see discrimination occur as the student touches the card less and less frequently when it is flipped to red and immediately touches it when it is flipped to green. Next, we will watch another video that involves a more complex response from the student.
Katie, draw a line. Nice job drawing a line. Let's write your name. Good touching the card. You can have a break. Katie, trace the line. Nice job tracing the line. Trace that line. Good job tracing the line. You can have write your name. Good touching the card. You can have a break. Trace the K. Nice job tracing the K, Katie. Trace the A. Trace the A, like that. You do it. You need to trace the A, like that. Trace the T. Trace the T, like that. You try. You need to trace the T, like that. Trace the I. Good job tracing the I, Katie. Trace the E. Good job tracing the E. Draw a line. Nice job drawing a line. Let's draw another line. Good touching the card. You can have a break. Trace the number 1. Good job writing the number 1. Trace the number 2. Trace the number 2, like I did. You try. You need to trace the number 2, like that. Write the number 3. Write the number 3, like that. You try. You need to write the number 3, like that. Write the number 4. You need to write the number 4, like I did. Good writing the number 4, Katie. Trace the circle. Awesome job tracing the circle. Draw a square. Good tracing the square, Katie. Draw a triangle. Good drawing a triangle. Write your name. Write your name, like I did. You do it. Good job writing your name, Katie. Write your name. Good touching the card. You can have a break.
In the previous video, we have a similar contingency in effect. The SD is the card being flipped to green, and the S delta is the card being flipped to red. However, in this example, they have now required a change response. First, the student must comply with instructions that increase in difficulty throughout the video. Compliance is then reinforced by the card being switched to green, which the student can then touch the card on the table to demand for a break from the work. Here, the green card would be considered a dual functioning chain stimulus. It reinforces the response that precedes it, which is the compliance, and is an SD for the following response, which would be touching the card on the table. There are several modifications you can make to discriminative stimuli when implementing interventions. This can all be done in order to increase skill acquisition and/or reduce problem behaviors. First, you can make instructions clear and concise. The more clear the instructions are, the greater the chances the student will be able to discriminate between the SD and the S delta conditions. Second, you can provide a supplemental prompt with the instruction or SD that is already in place. A supplemental prompt may raise the probability of a correct response, but it should be faded. And last, if you're working with a client who has rule-governed behavior, you can review the rules before beginning. This would basically involve explaining the conditions under which a response will be reinforced or punished, and when a response will not be reinforced or punished. This is just explaining the SD and S delta conditions. Looking at the previous videos we've watched, let's see what modifications we could make to the discriminative stimuli. First, the first suggestion was to make the instructions clear and concise. The students in the video, however, did a really great job showing the client when the card was switched. If they had not done this, it would be suggested to make it known exactly when the SD is present and when the S delta is present. The next suggestion is providing a supplemental prompt with the instruction. They could have also included a verbal prompt, such as the technician saying, "The card is green," or "The card is now red." And last, they could have reviewed the rules before beginning, so explain to the SD and S delta. So again, if you're working with a student who has a rule-governed behavior, you could review the rule beforehand. For example, for the second video, the technician could have said, "You must comply with the instruction for the card to turn green. Then you can touch the card to get a break." Question: what modification to the discriminative stimuli would the following be? Instead of saying, "Touch dog" during receptive ID, the tutor should simply say, "Dog." A. Making instructions clear and concise. B. Providing a supplemental prompt with the instruction. C. Reviewing the rules before beginning. Or D. None of the above. On your homework sheet, fill in the question, what modification to the SD would the following be? I'll give you some time to get your homework sheet filled out. The answer to the previous question was A, making the instructions clear and concise. By removing the word touch, the student can attend to the stimuli that should be controlling their response, which is the word dog. Again, by making the instructions clear and concise, it makes it easier for the student to discriminate between the SD and the S delta. If the SD included the word touch, then the animal's name, the student may only be attending to the word touch instead of what should be controlling their response. On your homework sheet, fill in the answer A, making instructions clear and concise. I'll give you some time to get that answer filled in. There are several factors that may affect whether stimulus control will be acquired. First, pre-attending skills. The development of stimulus control requires certain prerequisite skills. For academic or social skills, the student should engage in orienting responses appropriate to the SD, such as orienting towards a speaker, scanning an array, or even sitting quietly for short periods of time. Second, stimulus salience. How salient a stimulus is in a learner's environment may affect the development of their stimulus control. by having more obvious cues with the SD and S delta can increase the acquisition of stimulus discrimination. Third, over-selective stimulus control. If a client has over-selective stimulus control, this means that they may focus on a minute part of a stimulus rather than the stimulus as a whole. For example, a student may only focus on the strings of a guitar as opposed to the guitar as a whole, or even the sound that the guitar makes. Stimulus blocking. This refers to when one stimulus blocks the effects of another stimulus that may already evoke a response. For example, a student may know the answers to a teacher's questions, but when in the presence of a peer group, they will not answer those questions. The peer group, blocks the other stimulus, the teacher's instruction, that would normally evoke the response of answering. Stimulus overshadowing. This refers to when the more salient of a compound stimulus will control responding, and it interferes with the acquisition of stimulus control by the more relevant stimulus. For example, when pictures and text were put together, students' acquisitions of reading sight words was delayed because the picture overshadowed the text. In these instances, it's important to make modifications to antecedents that we mentioned before to increase skill acquisition. Now we will move on to the next antecedent, motivating operations. Motivating operation is defined by Malott and Shane as a procedure or condition that affects learning and performance with respect to a particular reinforcer or aversive condition. The term motivating operation is actually an umbrella term, which will go more in depth on what falls under the umbrella of motivating operation. The first type of MO that we'll discuss is establishing operations. These increase the effectiveness of some object or event as a reinforcer. They also increase the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus, object, or event. The other type of MO is an abolishing operation. These, on the other hand, decrease the effectiveness of some object or event as a reinforcer, and also decrease the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus, object, or event. Motivating operations have two effects. The first effect is the value altering effect. These increase or decrease in reinforcing effectiveness. The second effect is the behavior altering effect. These increase in frequency or decrease in frequency. If it increases in frequency, that means that it has an evocative effect. And if it decreases a response's frequency, that means it has an abative effect. Now let's discuss unconditioned motivating operations. These establish or abolish the value of stimuli as reinforcers without prior learning. Some examples of unconditioned motivating operations include food, water, oxygen, activity, or sleep. Now let's look at unconditioned motivating operations as establishing operations. Again, this means that they will increase the effectiveness of some object or event as a reinforcer, and they'll increase the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus, object, or event. The term deprivation is relevant here. This is defined by Malott and Shane as withholding a reinforcer increases relevant learning and performance. If we take a look in the Skinner box, an MO of food deprivation will increase the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer and will also increase responses that have been consequated with food. Now we can look at unconditioned motivating operations as abolishing operations. Again, these will decrease the effectiveness of some object or event as a reinforcer and decrease the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced by that stimulus, object, or event. The term satiation is relevant here. This is also defined by Milan Shane as consuming a substantial amount of a reinforcer decreases relevant learning and performance. The MO of having recently eaten or being satiated on food will decrease the effectiveness of food as a reinforcer, and it will also decrease any response, such as lever pressing, that is consequated with having food. Here we see in the applied setting the establishing operation, the athlete running 10 miles, which also results in water deprivation, has a value altering effect which establishes water as an effective reinforcer. It also has the behavior altering effect. It evokes behaviors maintained by access to water. An AO, or abolishing operation, the athlete having just drank water or being water satiated, has a value altering effect which abolishes water as an effective reinforcer, and it also has a behavior altering effect which abates behaviors maintained by access to water. There are also conditioned motivating operations. These are motivating variables that alter the reinforcing effectiveness of other stimuli, objects, or events as a result of the organism's learning history. There are three types of conditioned motivating operations: a CMOS or surrogate, CMOR or reflexive, and a CMOT, transitive. For the sake of this presentation, we're going to keep it simple and only go over a description and example of each. A CMOS alters the value of consequences that are under the control of an MO with which it has been paired. For example, the time on the clock influences the reinforcing value of food. The time would be a CMOS because it has been paired with food. A CMOR alters the value of its own removal or continued presence as a type of reinforcement or punishment. The delivery of a demand establishes the reinforcing value of its removal. Warning stimuli are often CMORs. A CMOT alters the value of another stimulus or event as a type of reinforcement or punishment. For example, the presence of a lock on a fridge establishes the reinforcing value of a key when access to food is valuable as a source of reinforcement. Question: which of the following is sleep deprivation? A. Conditioned motivating operation, surrogate. B. Conditioned motivating operation, reflexive. C. Conditioned motivating operation, transitive. Or D. Unconditioned motivating operation. On your homework sheet, fill in the question, which of the following is sleep deprivation? I'll give you some time to get that question filled in. The answer to the previous question was D, UMO, or unconditioned motivating operation. Sleep deprivation requires no learning history to function as a motivating operation. It would have evocative effects, meaning it would increase behaviors that result in sleep, and it would also have abative effects, meaning it would decrease behaviors that result in no sleep. On your homework sheet, fill in the answer D, UMO. I'll give you some time to get that filled in. When making modifications to motivating operations in the applied setting, we must remain ethical. For example, we cannot manipulate motivating operations in regards to basic needs, such as depriving a client of food or water. However, satiation and deprivation can be utilized to work on skill acquisition and behavior reduction, which we'll see in the following slides. Making modifications to the MO involving satiation. An example includes, your client is engaging in problem behavior when having to leave the hallway. By modifying his MO to gain access to the hallway, you can decrease his problem behavior. For example, you would then take him to the hallway more frequently, and then he would become satiated on this. Here we see the MO and effect of having spent only a little bit of time in the hallway. The child must leave the hallway, but if they flop to the ground, they must not leave the hallway, which with the MO and effect is going to increase that response because the after condition of not having to leave the hallway has become more effective. However, if we switch the MO by modifying it and satiating the child on spending time in the hallway, it will then decrease the effect of the escape condition, and it will decrease the response of flopping to the ground. Now we can look at modifications to the MO in the form of deprivation. The example here is your client's highest preferred edible is M&Ms, and you are working on potty training. A modification you can make is restrict access to M&Ms, except when the client successfully initiates a request and voids in the toilet. Now let's look at the potty training example. Before, your client has no M&M, and if he voids in the toilet, he will receive an M&M. However, with the MO and effect of free access to M&Ms, or even no restriction to M&Ms, the reinforcing effectiveness of an M&M is not that high, and therefore behaviors that result in M&Ms, such as voiding in the toilet, aren't going to increase in frequency. However, once you modify the MO, such as restricting access to M&Ms, it will then increase the reinforcing effectiveness of M&Ms and then increase the frequency of responses, voiding in the toilet, that result in M&Ms. We will now watch a video that provides examples in the literature of modifications to MOs.
This presentation will be focusing on the use of altering motivating operations through both satiation and deprivation. There are several different ways motivating operations can be used, which will be touched on later, but the intervention strategies I will be focusing on primarily throughout will be altering motivating operations as a strategy to decrease problem behavior and increase skill acquisition. First, I want to discuss some assumptions about problem behavior. So problem behavior is assumed to be occurring because there's an EO and effect for it. Therefore, by eliminating the EO by ways such as satiation, you're creating an abolishing operation, which may result in a decrease of problem behavior. A study conducted by O'Reilly et al. In 2008 attempted to decrease problem behavior in 3 individuals with severe disabilities by reducing the evocative effect of the MO for the problem behavior. An easy and unobtrusive strategy to decrease problem behavior is to alter the motivating operation that is in effect.
O'Reilly et al. Suggest first to conduct an FA to determine the maintaining consequence, which ideally will be a reinforcer that's socially mediated. Second, pick a measurement system such as momentary time sampling or partial interval recording that is appropriate for the topography of the target behavior, and take data throughout the day to identify the relative rate of behavior and the setting event in which the behavior most often occurs. Once you've identified the maintaining reinforcer and the setting event, the third step is to provide at least 15 minutes of free access to the reinforcer immediately prior to the identified setting event. An important note the authors make is that the pre-session access must result in satiation, thereby functioning as an abolishing operation. Otherwise, if they don't satiate, access may function as a priming session and inadvertently create an establishing operation for behavior. This intervention strategy alters the establishing operation by providing free access to the maintaining reinforcers up until the point of satiation, thereby creating an abolishing operation which can lead to a decrease in problem behavior. You can use the strategy of altering motivating operations to decrease behavior if the behavior interferes with their daily living and if you have the resources to do so. Do not use the strategy alone. Always use it in conjunction with another procedure, such as a DRA, which will establish an appropriate alternative to compete with the problem behavior. Two studies increased two different types of skill acquisition by restricting access and creating an EO, which both altered the value of the reinforcer as well as increased the frequency of behavior maintained by those reinforcers. Taylor et al. Conducted a study in 2005 to evaluate the effects of manipulating the establishing operation of deprivation on skill acquisition in children with autism. First, conduct a preference assessment to identify potentially reinforcing stimuli to be used in the intervention. Taylor et al. Conducted a free operant preference assessment, which occurs in the natural environment and involves allowing the learner to engage in activities freely, and data is taken on the amount of time the learner spends with each item. Operationally define the target response so that everyone involved in the intervention is aware of what is considered an occurrence or non-occurrence, and then take a baseline data to identify where the learner is relative to the steps in the skill acquisition program. Stimuli that were identified in the preference assessment as highly preferred, in this case stimuli the learner engaged with the longest, can be restricted to promote deprivation, thereby creating an EO and increasing the value of that stimuli as a reinforcer. Follow the skill acquisition program as outlined and use the highly preferred yet restricted stimulus as reinforcement. Withholding access deprives the learner of that item or activity, thereby creating an EO by altering the value of that item as a reinforcer. Kenger, Jones, and Feenup conducted a study in 2014 using an intervention strategy similar to the one used by Taylor et al. However, rather than conducting a preference assessment, they conducted an FA to identify the function of tacting colors. The FA in their study determined that higher rates of tacting occurred when attention was provided. Their intervention then involved restricted access to attention prior to every session. Therefore, restricting access to attention created an EO and altered the frequency of tacting behavior. Altering motivating operations can be used to establish a reinforcer as valuable to promote skill acquisition, or it can be used to increase the frequency of behavior a learner already has. Brief access to a reinforcer can also be used to prime a response, which can increase the frequency of a given behavior. Do not use this strategy to withhold essential primary reinforcement. Instead, use the periods of food and water deprivation throughout the day to increase motivation. So for example, run a program reinforced by food before lunch when you know they're hungry, thereby creating an EO for food as reinforcement.
The final topic for today is to compare and contrast motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. There are several similarities between MOs and SDs. First, they both occur before a response. They also both alter the current frequency of some type of behavior, and they also both evoke a behavior. The main difference between the SD and MO is that the SD affects behavior because its presence has been correlated with the differential availability of an effective reinforcer in the past, whereas the MO controls behavior because of its relation to the differential effectiveness of a reinforcer for that behavior. We're now going to go over a few examples, and we'll have you identify the SD and MO in each example. Question: identify the SD and MO. Example: a client, Tom, loves to run to the playground when his teacher says, "It's time for recess." But recess moved to after lunch, so now Tom is a bit sluggish going to recess. On your homework sheet, fill in the question, identify the SD and MO. I'll give you a second to get that filled in. The answer to the previous question is the SD, teacher says it's time for recess, and the MO, recently ate lunch. On your homework sheet, make sure to get this filled in. I'll give you a few seconds to get this filled in. Here we see the full contingency for the playground example. The child is not able to play outside, and in the presence of the teacher saying it's time for recess, running to the playground is reinforced by being able to play outside. However, running to the playground in the presence of the teacher not saying it's time for recess is not reinforced. The MO in effect here has an abative effect. Recently eating lunch will decrease the reinforcing effectiveness of being able to play outside, and it will decrease the frequency of the response that results in being able to play outside. Question: identify the SD and MO. Ian doesn't normally yell, but after a poor night's sleep, he will yell at his friends if they are talking really loudly. On your homework sheet, fill in the question, identify the SD and MO. I'll give you a moment to get that filled in. The answer to the previous question is the SD, friends talking loudly, and the MO, sleep deprived. On your homework sheet, fill in this answer. I'll give you a few seconds to get that filled in. Here we can see the full contingency for the yelling example. Ian hears loud noises. So in the presence of his friends talking loudly, he yells at his friends to quiet down, and he hears less loud noises. However, in the presence of his friends talking quietly, yelling at his friends to quiet down is extinguished because the loud noises do not decrease. The MO in effect here is sleep deprivation. This is going to increase the reinforcing effectiveness of the loud noises quieting down, and it's going to increase the frequency of the response yelling at his friends to quiet down, which results in the loud noises decreasing. Question: identify the SD and MO. The example here, Ariana hasn't seen her daughter in several days while she's been over at her father's house. But today she sees her daughter's book bag hanging on the chair, so she runs up to her room to see her. On your homework sheet, fill in the question, identify the SD and MO. I'll give you a few moments to get that filled in. The answer to the previous question is SD, the sight of the book bag on the chair, and the MO, hasn't seen daughter in several days. Make sure to get this filled in on your homework sheet. I'll give you a few moments to do that. Here we have the full contingency for the daughter example. Running to the daughter's room in the presence of the sight of the daughter's book bag being on the chair is reinforced by the sight of the daughter in the room. However, running to the daughter's room when no sight of the daughter's book bag is on the chair is extinguished with no sight of the daughter. The MO in effect here, not having seen the daughter in a few days, has an evocative effect. It's going to increase the reinforcing effectiveness of the sight of the daughter and is going to increase the frequency of responses that will result in that consequence. So running to the daughter's room when the sight of the daughter's book bag is on the chair. This concludes today's training over task list item D3, implement interventions based on modifications of antecedents, such as motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. Now you'll be required to take a short quiz over today's training.